Good afternoon, good morning. We will start in a couple of minutes just to let everybody join the meeting. So another couple of minutes of patience, and then we will start. So good afternoon or good morning, depending where you are. Welcome to our webinar series. It's a joint DAI ECDPM webinar practical series where we focus on connecting public and private responses to COVID-19 and its implication on development. DAI is a consultancy, ECDPM is a European think tank, and we are very happy to join forces in this series of webinars. We started already 2 weeks ago, mid-June, with a webinar on the private sector, and we had last week one focusing on that digitalization. And today we will focus on finance. Next week we will have one on global health. My name is Bilal. I'm the head of the Trade, Investment and Finance program at ECDPM, and I will be your host today for this prestigious panel that we have with us. We have Catherine Collin, who from the European Investment Bank, who is the head of regional representation in East Africa, and she's joining us from Nairobi. And we have with us also Søren Andreasen, who is the general manager of the Associations of European Development Finance Institutions, joining us from Brussels. And we have Tilman Bruet, who is the global practice lead for financial services and investments at DAI. And so they will share with us their practical expertise and experience responding to COVID. Just small practical logistical aspects. We have many participants, so we will not be able to give the floor for raising your questions by speaking, but you can do so by using the Q&A that you will find at the bottom of your screen, the little logo where you have on your right-hand side where you have a Q&A, and so you can please do so at any time, and we will bring your questions to the speakers. It is really a privilege to be able to discuss this issue of financing, which is really very high on the agenda of the response to COVID. We have seen advanced economies really using all the fiscal space that they have at their disposal to try to respond as strongly as possible and to finance as strongly as possible the response to the COVID crisis. And according to the IMF, using up to 8.6% of their GDP and probably even more for several of them. For emerging economies, this has been much more difficult to respond as strongly. Only 2.8% of their GDP has been dedicated to the response to the COVID. And for low-income countries that have even lower fiscal space to respond, it's only 1.4% of their GDP. according to IMF figures. So that shows that while the crisis is global, the capacity to respond to the crisis has been quite different depending on the level of development. And so the role of development finance is quite important. Another dimension that we also identified in the response to the pandemic is that there's of course a lot of focus on what can the state do and what would be the public response and the public efforts and public financing could be done. But we also know that if we don't want to have an economic crisis lasting for too long, and if we want to have a prompt recovery, or at least a recovery that is not too delayed over time, the role of the private sector is absolutely key. And so the need to support the private sector has been really high on the agenda, also of advanced economies. And in developing countries, we know also that the private sector is the key job provider. So it is really important in this crisis that the development finance is providing support to private sector to go over the crisis in addressing some of the liquidity shortage. But we also know that not all the companies will be able to ride the crisis easily. And so we want to, as much as possible, avoid defaults and bankruptcies from companies that otherwise could be viable. So in that sense, that calls is really for a strong role for development finance and development financiers that will have then to operate, and that have already to operate in a much riskier environment, having themselves much higher exposure to this risk. But it is important they react also in part to save their own assets. So there's been a lot of investments over the years that have been done by the development finance institutions and other development financiers. And if they don't try to react at the time of the crisis, they might lose a lot of their own investments. And the crisis also might be much bigger for the private sector that they try to support. So their first reaction has been, in general, to help their clients. And we will see during this discussion how they have done so. But also it is important that they don't just restrict to their existing clients, but they are able to reach out to those that are also in need, and so that they can reach out to new segments of the market and engage in new activities. That's the essential, so not to do business simply as usual, but to really be able to step up their efforts so they can really be counter-cyclical. And they have to do that in a fast way, not in a very slow and long process oriented, and they have to do so in a sustainable manner. So for the development finances, this is already a new way of working. And what do they need to be able to do, and how do they need to adjust? Well, as I mentioned, there's a much riskier environment, so there is a need for the development financiers to be able to take more risk and to cover more risk also for their clients. And that means providing different forms of interventions, having themselves guarantees and being able also to pass on some guarantees to some of their clients. But for some of the DFIs and some of the financial institutions, that might also require from their own shareholders an increase of capital so that they can act more forcefully. And in fact, we're already seeing that in the context, for instance, of Europe. The European Investment Bank president has been calling for an increase of capital so that the EIB can respond better to the needs within the EU, but also outside the EU. They also need to coordinate much better and to strengthen their coordination, and we'll see also during this session some examples of coordinations. But they need to coordinate first and foremost with the local actors. So the development finances will not be able to substitute for the local initiatives, but they should build on these local initiatives and these local responses by public authorities, by public and private financial institutions at the local level. and team up with the local private sector and with these local initiatives. You remember a couple of weeks ago we heard on the private sector that some of the private sector associations were also trying to build up guarantees and mechanisms. So it is important that the development financiers build on these local initiatives and do not only try to do parallel activities. The other element, of course, is that among themselves they have to work much better and reinforce their actions. At the European level, the EU has been trying to push such a response through the Team Europe approach, which is to bring the EU institutions together with the EU member states responding as donors, but also as development financiers for their DFIs. And so there's been a lot of efforts to try to do this, and we will also see what is the DFIs themselves have been trying to do to reinforce their cooperation. But this is very important. It's not to work one against the other or to be competitors, but to try to really pull all the resources and efforts together to be the most effective. It's important that they do that also, as I mentioned, with the local actors, and in many regions and countries, you have regional development banks, national development banks that are very useful, but also with the international community, the multilateral development banks, and I would say with the more traditional donors. So knowing that even in advanced countries, there is a restriction in public resources, including for development, it is important that the donors' money is better leveraged and therefore worked with through blended finance and other modalities or guarantees to allow the DFIs to respond better. And we can imagine a lot of different forms of joint initiatives. I've recently written a paper about how the EU, at least at the EU level, there could be such a global response strengthened. There are different mechanisms that exist. One could imagine setting up different platforms also to better coordinate such response like it exists already in some regions, like in the case of the Western Balkans, for instance. And the last point, before I give the floor to the first speaker, is that while we do these efforts, it is of course important that the recovery be a sustainable one, be a green recovery. And I cannot stress enough, but I think it is really time to do much more gender finance and mainstreaming the gender financing, not just with some pet projects for women and to be able to tick the box exercise, but to really put them at the center of the recovery. We know that in many developing countries, these are the recovery will depend on the capacity to involve women. So it is important for an equality purpose, but also for an effectiveness purposes. So with these introductory words, I would like to give the floor to Catherine Collin from the EIB, since we know the EIB is also at the center at the European level of many of these responses, but to give us some of the perspectives of what does it mean in practice, all these nice principles that I've announced. How have you reacted with the COVID crisis? Catherine Collin, it's fantastic that you remain also in Nairobi close to your clients, but could you perhaps tell us what did you do to react? What are the challenges you have encountered, and how do you cooperate in the field? Catherine, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Stan, and thanks to you and the organizer for having asked me to participate and present the perspective from the field, because I know there are lots of discussion taking place of Brussels with my colleagues based in Luxembourg and in Brussels, but it's good to hear as well what we are doing in the field. If maybe, I mean, I'm not going to introduce EIB, but EIB in Nairobi, I mean, we've been based in Nairobi since 2005, and we have a team of 10 colleagues working here, a mix of financial people, but also 2 experts in the energy and water and sanitation sector. And our activity in the region is really covering key economic and social infrastructure, transport, energy, very present, about 75%, as well as water and sanitation, as I mentioned, either through public sector lending or through private sector lending. One of our flagship projects for Sub-Saharan Africa is in Kenya. It's the Lake Turkana wind farm, which is a 315 megawatt wind farm established in one of the most remote locations here in Kenya. A very impressive project and a very good example of private sector partnering with the public sector to be able to produce now about 17% of the energy mix of the country. But we are also extremely active in the SME lending and financial sector support, where we've been deploying over 1 billion euro since 2007 to support medium and small, micro and small and medium enterprises. This is also combined with a big technical assistance program. We also have developed more recently a portfolio of corporate loans and investments in both venture capital but also impact funds, which are reaching out to those small entrepreneurs or innovative entrepreneurship that are quite frequent here in the region. All of this is done in a very strong cooperation with the EU. Actually, here in Nairobi, my offices are in the EU delegation, so we are an integral part of the Team Europe, as it is called now. And as you know, the way EIB responded to the COVID crisis, as you most probably know, so EIB has announced a global response covering both inside the EU and outside the EU, and I think that's something that all of us who strongly believe of the role of the bank and of the European Union outside the EU welcomed. So this rests on 4 pillars, which are very rapidly. So the first pillar is it's really health preparedness, so that's supporting the immediate needs in the health sector throughout our countries of in operation, and that entails a very strong cooperation with the WHO as well as UN agency, which you may have seen a number of announcements in that respect, and there is work being done to have some concrete cases coming up very soon. We've also had the second pillar that's more economic resilience. That means supporting sovereigns, so sovereign loans, to help governments supporting the real economy depending on the type of measure. This morning I was discussing with a colleague in the Rwanda delegation. The Rwandese government is putting in place a recovery fund, and they may be interested in getting a sovereign loan from the EIB to add to their own funding of this recovery fund that will help support small and medium enterprise, tourism, and so forth in Rwanda. Third axe is the boosting access to finance. Boosting access to finance is really about addressing liquidity squeezes and possible increased risk aversion by the banks in our country of operation. This is an area in East Africa, at least, where we've been extremely active over the last 10 years, at least. And so we have a very important portfolio of local financial intermediaries whom we know, with whom we are working, and with whom we are prepared to help go over this crisis. And then the last pillar is more supporting corporates being EU companies or their subsidiary who are suffering from the COVID crisis in their activity in our regions, but also companies who are active in the health and digital sectors. And we are looking at a couple of corporate transactions in relation to developing either manufacturing of equipment or vaccines, so all strictly related to the COVID crisis. So, and of course, as Sam mentioned, I mean, all of this comes on top of the fact that we are also accompanying our clients, our existing clients, in the difficulties that they may be facing due to the crisis. So looking at all the forbearance requests that we are getting from clients and see how we can best respond to that. So now, if I look at the case of Kenya and how we've worked out, I would say here in Kenya, we've very early in the process, and because we have this close relationship with the EU delegation, we've done a bit of a brainstorming on how best to act or to react, if I may say. Luckily in Kenya, due to a number of circumstances, there was quite a fairly substantial amount of grant money that was available to support the EU reaction, and so we are really, our intervention will be about boosting access to finance. So we will be putting in place new lines of credit with banks locally, and these lines of credit will be blended with an EU grant. And so we're working hand in hand with the EU to try and make new liquidity available at affordable rates, if I may say. That will enable the banks to lend, because some of them are not prepared to lend anymore, but also to lend at reasonable rates. So that's one part. And on top of that, we will be accelerating existing lines of credit, like we've made them more flexible in terms of eligibility criteria, allowing the banks to use them for working capital needs of the SMEs, requesting financing. So all these measures that should accelerating the injection of additional liquidity in the economy. In parallel to this, we are talking also to the government of Kenya, because we have explained to the government what the intervention was about, and we may also be looking at a sovereign facility that will help the government in all the resilience measure that they want to put in place. We're discussing with the central bank, we're discussing with Treasury. I have to say that practically here there is a very strong cooperation among EU member states, the EU and the EU DFIs. So there are regular meetings where we exchange everybody's proposed intervention and see where there are possible synergies. The Team Europe, I would say, factor here is very strongly present, and I have to say it's nice to see everybody playing the game, if I may say, because we know that it's not always the case. But here there is a very strong dynamic and a positive dynamic in terms of Europe, and I have to say I observe that in most of the countries that I cover from Nairobi. So I think it's an important element. And also we cooperate very closely with other development partners, as you mentioned. I mean, there is a development partner group here, which is very active and that meet regularly at heads of mission level, and where there is also a fairly active exchange of view with the World Bank and the IMF, of course, being very present in there. Now, in terms of challenges, because of course not everything is perfect and there is no perfect world, I think one of the challenges that we are facing in this response to the COVID crisis.
We cannot hear you, Catherine. We just lost you. There's no sound anymore. You disconnected something, the microphone? We don't hear you. I think I'm not the only one, no? So perhaps we'll try to sort out this technical. It's a pity, Catherine, because that was very interesting what you were telling us in terms of what you were saying. I think you might have disconnected your microphone and reconnect. I perhaps switch off and come back. I suggest we go perhaps to Søren, since you were just talking about how the difference, how you were coordinating with the other development finance institutions and the good coordination. Perhaps we go to Søren Andreasen, who is the general manager of the Association of European Development Finance Institutions, and perhaps can tell, Søren, you can tell us about what are some of the initiatives you have taken, and then we will have Catherine hopefully able to join back with the microphone working. Søren, you have started the DFI Alliance. That's in fact reading what you were doing. That's what triggered the focus also of our session, saying we should focus on how different institutions can cooperate together. Can you tell us how the different European DFIs have responded to COVID and joining forces together?
Yes, thank you, San. And I hope we will have Catherine back very soon. You hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, good. Well, it's great to be here. Thanks a lot to you and DAI for hosting and inviting us to discuss this. So the group of DFIs that I represent are the bilateral DFIs, as we call them, of 15 European countries. We work in very similar ways to what Catherine described about the European Investment Bank. We focus exclusively on investments in the private sector to help develop markets and to mobilize private investment. And when we are seeing a shock like the one that we are seeing in vulnerable markets now, our job is really to stay put and continue to work and protect the impact that we have helped create together with our clients in these markets, and to be present when private investors are ready to come back and to help lead the way into the recovery. So I would just briefly talk about three ways that DFIs are working together and why this is an absolutely crucial, I believe, aspect of how publicly backed development finance and investment like what we do is really, really crucial. At the most fundamental level, it's really essential that as policy-driven institutions, when there is a crisis, we make things move as fast as possible and that we have as much collaboration as possible. I mean, the nightmare scenario would be that good information is preventing us from taking good decisions, and that we don't quickly share information, and that somehow when we are in investments together, and we very often are co-investors as DFIs, almost half of what we do with two or more DFIs together in different constellations. It's really essential that we keep the situation of the client and of the impact that we are creating first in mind, and that we don't that we have a very constructive joint engagement. So in the immediate response, we have had a very intensive process of very regular interactions to share information about what we are seeing in the market and to coordinate around the portfolios and the needs of the thousands of clients that we finance, the institutions in our group, but also with our collaborators in institutions like the bilateral DFIs in North America with EIB and EBRD and IFC, the big multilateral investors. And we have also seen a lot of cooperation on the non-financial support side. We have, of course, clients that are in difficult situations and that are under pressure at the moment and are struggling to keep employees on their payrolls. And that means that there's a number of social, but also environmental and governance-related topics that they need to really pay attention to. But beyond the collaboration about the immediate response, we are also trying to do two other things. So we are trying to see if we can reinforce the firepower that our institutions have in the markets where we operate. And we are trying to see how we can work towards a strong recovery when it comes. So in terms of reinforcing firepower, we are working also with think tanks like yours, San, to really remind everybody that the response in support of the private sector is critical in vulnerable countries, just like it is in the OECD countries where our institutions are founded and based. And we are working very closely to make it easy for larger volumes of co-financing to flow to the clients that are able to deploy additional financing and additional impact, and also to bring governments and donor agencies into the discussion about risk-sharing facilities and so on. So this is in Europe, we're working closely with the EU institutions, both the European Commission and EIB, to make sure that we can do this. And many of our institutions or DFIs are also working with their own governments to reinforce their capacities. In terms of the working on a strong recovery, we want to keep in mind that the recovery is one that both has to be strong, meaning that we need to recover as strongly and quickly as possible. And ideally, of course, also it has to be as transformative as possible. And there are a few things that we are trying to keep in mind there. So we think that in a sense, as DFIs, there's a very important demonstration effect that we have by being able to deploy our capital as quickly as possible when the recovery begins, to speed up the curve of the recovery. It's really, I mean, and let's be honest, Catherine talked about some of the challenges. It's really difficult to know exactly where we are in this crisis in vulnerable countries right now. It's hard to discern the health impacts, and it's hard to anticipate what the economic recovery will look like and how quickly it can come. So we of course are trying to understand the markets as well as possible, but also we are really trying to be one step ahead in terms of bringing investments back in. We also working with pipelines, and often in a coordinated way, to try to see how it is that we can overcome some of the challenges that are likely to slow us down in the recovery. So it's obvious that our institutions have some local teams on the ground, but usually in one country serving many countries. We rely normally on a lot of travel to complete due diligence and client conversations and so on. We now need to find ways that we can keep moving the pipeline forward, keep making investments at scale without being as present as we used to be. And that means really reinforcing local networks of local partners that have the expertise at a completely different scale than what we usually do, both to make sure that we are doing the right thing, but also just to move things ahead as quickly as possible. And then we definitely have some themes that we are working on collaboratively for the recovery. So with our partners in the DFI Alliance, between our European DFIs and North American DFIs, and EIB has also been very much involved in this, we have what we call the 2X initiative, Financing Women Initiative, which is a very ambitious initiative to try and scale up quickly the financing for businesses that are founded and led by women, or that involve many women in their operations. This is a major transition challenge that we are working on as institutions, and there's a lot of collaboration going on around that. And then at the same time, when it comes to climate and energy, we also, of course, expect this to be a major recovery theme. And the European Union institutions are, together with our DFIs, pushing this topic very hard. The final thing I would say is that over the years, DFIs have not always been as good as we should be in informing investment readiness in the economies we invest in. The whole policy reform agenda has not always progressed in a way that it has been inviting investment at the scale that we would really like to see. And we think it's absolutely crucial that we put all the knowledge that we have as development finance institutions to use of governments that want to invite private finance back into their markets at scale. Many of the countries are facing debt sustainability issues because of a lot of sovereign borrowing over the last years. And we do believe that policy reforms that increase investment readiness are going to be a crucial component of having a sort of a steep recovery curve, which we very much hope for. And this is something that DFIs are also working very closely together to drive. So we are here to collaborate instead of step on each other's toes as institutions, and we're here to remind everybody that we are just we're starting what we have called a decade of action for development with a major setback with this crisis, and there is we cannot skip any beats in terms of getting back in the recovery, and we're working very hard to try and do that. And I think that's my remarks for now, San.
Okay, thank you very much, Søren. Catherine, you are also back. We don't know if we can hear you unless you use your microphone. So can you hear us properly? You can hear us, but we can still not hear you. That's a pity because we were having, I mean, since 2 o'clock we have been online and talking and hearing very well and checking. So really sorry, but perhaps so let me just I'll turn more to Søren because it was in fact questions to both of you, Catherine and Søren, on the Team Europe dimension. There are several questions. The first one is, DFIs, Søren, we have not really been, I mean, at least from Brussels, did not seem to have been very visible in the Team Europe response. We hear a lot about EIB, EBRD, but in terms of the role of DFIs, they seem to have been just included into what member states are doing. So there's a question of what has been the role of DFIs in the Team Europe response. And there's also a question if on the grounds this Team Europe is visible to the other parties on the ground, or is it just something that, it's an internal kitchen for the EU as the response, but it is not visible? So, I don't know if you can address some of these points.
Yes. Well, the Team Europe, to those of you who don't know what the concept is, it's essentially an effort by the EU institutions to say that the EU institutions, or it's by the European Union to say that the EU institutions, so that is the EIB and the European Commission and so on, needs to work very closely with the member state level institutions so that our combined response is as effective as possible. And we have a European development finance architecture which both has a lot of effort or firepower at the national level and a lot at the European level. And so as DFIs, we, for instance, when we look at the private sector of development finance, as DFIs, we move the majority of investment taking place by publicly backed institutions in Europe into sub-Saharan Africa and other vulnerable regions. So we play an absolutely crucial role. And so when you say that we only play a role as part of the member state response, I mean, that is technically legally true. But we have a very, very close cooperation with the EU institutions to make sure that our combined firepower is as strong as possible. And of course, our teams on the ground have a lot of joint clients, a lot of joint projects to try and respond. So I think there is one from a communications point of view. We as institutions and the member states that own our DFIs are fully on board with the Team Europe approach. Sometimes we DFIs work a little bit more like private sector institutions. So we know what we would expect to invest in a normal year, and we have made a signal or a determination to invest the same type of level this year as we did last year, despite the crisis. So to be really counter-cyclical. But we have not yet announced what these numbers will be because we because we have plenty of firepower, but we have not announced in advance. We have the authorizations to keep working and to keep investing. And so we have not gone and made COVID-specific authorizations. We are just committed to using our balance sheets to do as much as possible. And that may be why. So we haven't said we are going to do X billion. We did $10 billion last year. We want to do the same, but we have not gone out and said we are committing 10 billion to COVID. And so maybe our approach has been a little bit different.
But the question, in fact, shouldn't be instead of doing the same as last year, since the crisis and the needs are higher this year, do you have the capacity to do more, and can you mobilize more and use your network to mobilize more and to have greater firepower this year? And perhaps as a follow-up to that question, of course, we also know that there's the European Fund for Sustainable Development that has been set up by the European Union, providing guarantees. And so, in principle, that could be an instrument to be used. But there was one of the questions is whether the time lag between the use of that guarantee and the recovery needs, or the emergency and recovery needs are in the short term, whether the EFSD can be an instrument to help respond now, or will it be too late?
Yeah, so this European Fund for Sustainable Development, which is essentially taking a large guarantee capacity of the EU and combining it with the work and client networks and pipelines of financial institutions like ours, is something that is just coming online in the market. And in fact, there has been a big acceleration of the efforts to use these EFSD guarantees from the EU this spring, especially after the crisis struck, because the instrument is extremely relevant now, and I expect also during the recovery, it's extremely relevant to reinforce our capacities as financial institutions, and to have the risk sharing with the EU budget that they provide. And by the way, it's also the model that the EU plans and has proposed to scale up massively in its next financial period, which starts next year. So we think these guarantees are extremely relevant. They turn out to be really a blessing for the response and recovery now. Some of them are just beginning to come online now. So of course, it would have been ideal if we had anticipated all of this and they would have been there from the beginning of the year. But that's not the reality we're in. But they are extremely relevant. And for us as DFIs working in the private sector, they're really also a kind of breakthrough, because we have not always had the focus on private sector operations from the EU institutions that we have now. And so there's really a convergence of strategic focus here.
Søren, if I may ask, do you have a sense for your normal business, what percentage of the portfolio or pipeline is delayed as a result of COVID, as opposed to what you're planning in addition to COVID?
So in our association, I don't have the members reporting in every month how much they're doing, but there is one thing that we observe quite widely among the DFIs, and that is that the number of clients that require deferrals of payments and restructurings is probably at the moment lower than what we had been preparing for when we started looking at this very seriously in March, and that can just be a matter of timing, so that it will still come in future, and I think that's definitely probably going to be the case in some markets. But at the same time, it also leads us to think that we cannot skip a beat in terms of thinking about the recovery, and in a way getting back to business as usual in our investing, and to think about bringing private investors back in. We have seen in public equities markets, and we have seen financial flows. After a massive hit in March and April, we saw quite some positive developments in May and into June. And so we hope that we can continue the recovery in that sense, and yet we have to be prepared for some setbacks. So we are hoping that we will have an excellent year in terms of volumes at the end of the year, but there is a lot of uncertainty right now about how it will play out.
Yeah, and you mentioned the difficulty of working on a pipeline or moving forward with different projects without being able to travel. Surprisingly, in this age, face-to-face and interpersonal contact is still a huge part of the financing business, whether it be through DFIs or private sector. So how are the DFIs that you're working with or planning to overcome that?
Yeah, so there's really a lot of there's a lot of work going on in this regard, and it varies a little bit from the type of financing that you do. Some of this is just legal. We have very high requirements on things like knowing our customers, avoiding money laundering and terrorism finance and so on in what we do. And that just puts some high legal bars for making sure the documentation is right. But it's also about things happening on the ground. So are the conditions for employees and other stakeholders of projects, are they living up to our requirements? And sometimes, do the assets physically exist before we say that they do exist? And this means that some of this you can do with reinforcing your local networks of experts. Some of it you can do a little bit what we are doing now. We are having DFIs that are working with what they call DDD, so drone-driven due diligence. So they really verified virtually that assets do exist and that they're configured in the way that they ought to be before they commission projects and so on. So there's a variety of things going on. I think a lot of it actually is something, it's forcing some developments in our way of working as DFIs that probably were overdue in some ways, but they are challenging nevertheless.
No, I think it's interesting to see you're looking at technology. And I wonder, have you looked or have they considered maybe the private sector that in ways that they could support? For example, I know there's big companies like Refinitiv and others that do this type of due diligence for international investors, including the type you mentioned. Or do you think that most institutions really need to keep all of this work in-house rather than rely on others who could do it?
There necessarily has to be a new kind of sharing of tasks, and there needs to be a lot of trust in partners that are located in the countries of operation. That's for sure. It's not that wasn't the case already before, of course, but this will definitely speed that up. And I think that there's a blessing in that, in the sense that this will, of course, help. This will help build a local capacity for high quality investment.
Thank you very much. You were asking very relevant questions. You work yourself, and DAI works with a lot of different donor countries in Europe, but you also been based in the US. You work a lot also with the US. You are not a DFI, but you work in this intersection between donors and private sector. So how yourself have you adapted to the situation of COVID? And what is the kind of initiatives that you find are perhaps the most helpful?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, DAI works, we're a large consulting firm or contractor, and we're one of the largest for the U.S. government, so U.S. Agency for International Development, State Departments and others, as well as the U.K. government, Foreign Commonwealth Office and DFID, and the EU. So we do a number of projects. So I think a lot of the things that, as we talk about shifting funding or getting more funding needed for COVID, what our role is usually then making that actually happen. So we've got 100 plus offices on the ground that are a mix of projects and programs for different funders. And so a lot of it falls to organizations like ours to figure out how to get that done once the paperwork is actually signed. And just by way of background, DAI is about 50 years old. We're employee owned. And I think that does influence the way that we think about how we do our work, because I think we do think a lot about our employees and also our partners, and have, I think what's been really striking to me is the first and foremost concern that's come out about our employees' health and safety, as well as the health and safety of our partners. But what I wanted to do is, instead of like saving the key messages for at the end, I want to put them up front because I think that we've heard a lot of them, and they echo some of our experience in trying to implement some of these funding channels on the ground. I think the first is in a crisis situation, really the importance of using existing channels that you already have as your first stop, and also working out arrangements with existing partners. So I think that we've seen that happen, and it's proving to be very effective. Also, I think another thing that we're not seeing as much attention paid to, but is a big role of ours, is make sure that as you are putting out more funding, that there is the capacity to actually absorb it. And I'll talk about a few projects where that's our role, is to make sure that that's the case. And then I think the other is, we've mentioned about the crisis and then recovery, but it's kind of blurry. I don't think any of us really know when the crisis ends and when recovery starts, and I think it's going to be something that waxes and wanes depending on what part of the world or what country you're dealing in. So I almost think we have to stop thinking about it as a logical progression, but we're just in a constant adaptation mode, and recognizing, I think as Soren said, we can't be doing business as usual anymore, because for at least for a while, business as usual isn't going to exist. And then I think along with those lines, as was discussed, as they say, don't let a good crisis go to waste. I think we're seeing, and I'll talk about this in the finance and investment space, an acceleration of trends we already saw in terms of using technology, in terms of relying more on working through local partners, and thinking creatively how to do things that perhaps is long overdue, but the COVID crisis is accelerating. One, just to ensure that the existing pipeline continues and that work gets done. But second is that there is an incredible amount of interest and goodwill in trying to finance around COVID. And so I think a result of that is that people are trying to be innovative. So I just wanted to give you some examples of things. Because of our position, we work between often private sector companies and host country governments, as well as DFIs or other bilateral funders. And so the responses we get come from either our partners on the ground, so governments or finance organizations, or actually from whoever is funding our project. And so what I'll share with you is a mixture. And I think the initial requests we got were actually from our partners on the ground. Can you help us with this or that? And oftentimes we were in the position of bringing those requests back to the EU or USAID or others. And sometimes it was the other way around. But as an example, in Egypt, we were asked through USAID's macroeconomic stabilization and reform program to help the relevant ministries assess what the outbreak's effects would be on key sectors so that they could forecast the revenue and expenditures and estimate what the repercussions were of COVID-19, so that as money came in to support Egypt, they could make more informed decisions in terms of how to allocate it and prioritize it. So working directly with those ministries was critical. In Malawi, as an example, we're working on an EU project which is about public finance management. And again, one of the challenges they were going to have is the existing procurement procedures were going to be too slow to actually respond to COVID. So it was we worked with them to draft new emergency procurement procedures, while at the same time making sure that it was transparent and that there were post-haste checks to make sure that the goods and services were procured and got to where they're supposed to. And I was interested to hear Catherine talk about the Government of Rwanda Emergency Relief Fund, because we actually worked on that initially too at the request of both the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Commerce and the Ministry of Trade and Industry, because they were trying to figure out how to come up with an SME emergency finance facility. So they're very concerned about the future of their SMEs. And Rwanda hasn't had a huge outbreak, but they did go into pretty strict lockdown right away. So the types of support that they were looking for is, hey, can you tell us what's going on in other countries? What are different efforts made? And that includes looking at countries, I think, as was mentioned, some actually have resources to dedicate to this, and a lot of them don't. So really trying to find the middle ground. And then the government has allocated $100 million to an emergency relief fund, part of which will be channeled towards SMEs through a combination of guarantees to SMEs directly to go to different banks to get borrowings, direct financing of banks to help them refinance and extend further financing to SMEs, and then also a credit cooperative or SACCO refinancing facility, recognizing that if they really want to get to the lowest level of SMEs, then they also need to work with the SACCOs. And I think, as mentioned, the government of Rwanda is really looking to have a coordinated response to this, not necessarily saying that everything needs to be put into this emergency relief fund, but that it be coordinated, because they are trying to make sure that the money gets to where it's needed in sectors that they've highlighted, like health and tourism, which are particularly hard hit. But I think another area that I wanted to point out before I talk briefly about our INVEST program, one is in Southern Africa. So we work on a trade and investment hub. And I think we haven't really talked about trade, but one of the big challenges is just how trade dried up. Orders are canceled, a lot of supply chains are under stress. And so in the USAID-funded Southern Africa Trade and Investment Hub, one of the things we're trying to do is make sure that those trade contacts between exporters and importers don't stop completely. And we're doing that in a couple ways. One is, as discussed, we're shifting to digital methods. So we're helping to set up both platforms for information sharing between importers and exporters, but also private equity companies that would need to come in and finance some of these exporters for them to be able to finance, as well as hosting online matchmaking sessions. And while this may not necessarily be helpful for the private sector to do the final stages of due diligence, it's very helpful for them to maintain pipeline building activities. And we're working very closely with local organizations, so local investment advisors, but also trade associations and business associations, to ensure that those associations can actually play the introductory role, and in the process build them up so that in the long term they can actually act as aggregators for an investment demand, especially among exporters, and then and then also possible sources of investment, private equity firms from overseas. Interestingly, that also involved them getting engaged in helping companies to meet the Food and Drug Administration standards in order to repurpose and provide PPE for the United States. So just to give you an example, the kinds of sort of flexible approaches that we've had to take is we allocated some of the money from this hub to actually contract an expert within the United States who works with FDA, so that he can work with the local experts within the African countries who are advising the textile firms on how they can repurpose to do the PPE to meet the Food and Drug Administration requirements. And then I just wanted to share with you about USAID Invest, and I realize I've gone over a little the 8 minutes. But we have a project which works very closely with USAID, and the whole intent of the project is to mobilize private capital. And the way that we do that, it's structured really as a very rapid procurement mechanism that finds specialized firms to come in and help facilitate getting capital into a project or country that's needed. It's about $167 million in the way that it functions as different parts of USAID. When they've identified a project or a need related to attracting private capital, they will approach the INVEST project. The INVEST project will help them, as needed, design the project, unless it's already very well designed on their part. And then they will reach out to, we have a group of some 250 partners that are a range of different investment type firms that we can reach out to actually turn around assistance fairly quickly. And that, of course, as you can imagine, has seen both positive and negative impacts as a result of COVID. So on the negative side, and I asked Soren about this, 12 of the planned projects were delayed, so some $57 million in investment that projects that we were working on are delayed as a result of COVID. But at the same time, there's been an increase or an addition of 15 new projects under the INVEST projects, which are linked to COVID, either directly to support the response to COVID or adaptations of existing projects to expand them. And actually, those are $63 million, so they've outweighed the amount that was lost. And it's had more traditional projects like the project would normally work on. So for instance, with USAID Tanzania, we were asked the USAID mission to figure out how can they go about financing faith-based hospitals within Tanzania, looking at options, looking at potential interested funders, and coming up with a strategy for them to see if that was feasible. Also, it was building a platform like the one I mentioned in Southern Africa to try to match investors and also companies in Moldova using a combination of a technological platform and regular event hosting virtually. And then one that was really a surprise was Italy. So I think in DAI's history, we've never worked in Italy before. But the U.S. Embassy in Rome announced a package of support of $50 million to assist Italy in its COVID response efforts. And that led them to look around the U.S. government for interesting ways to do this. And they became aware of this USAID Invest project and actually approached it and said, could you help attract funding into the Italian fashion industry or the garment industry to help them repurpose for PPE production? Some of them need financial support, and we'd like to attract international investment to it. So in fact, that's what we worked on, issuing a request for information first to a number of investment houses saying, what would stop you from doing this? What would you need to do? And then issuing RFP such that firms that are interested in either investing or facilitating investment into Italian SMEs that are repurposing for PPE, not only for Italy's use, but also for global use, could have anywhere from $500,000 to $2 million to work on a number of different things. They could use it for first tranche capital to lower risk. They could use it as leverage to secure additional financing, or it could even be used as just initial startup capital. For instance, for a fund to invest in a firm that is looking to retool manufacturing or distribution activities that are linked to COVID. So this is very unusual that we should be working a different side of the equation. Normally our work is within the developing country context, but it just goes to show you this is a global pandemic. And as discussed with the trade project and also this one, it's really important to consider what's happening not just in developing countries, but the linkages between the developed and the developing. And with that, I'll stop. I hope that gives you a flavor of some of the things that actually are happening on the ground that we see.
Yes, indeed, a lot. And let me just rebound on your last comment and the connections that you made between what's happening at the global level and in developing countries. Do you still see in the COVID world this appetite to do investment in developing countries? Or is it more because, you know, there is also the crisis in the US, in Europe, so in the advanced economies. So are the investors as attracted by investing in developing countries? And if they are they also willing to go perhaps in these more risky or these lower segment of markets closer to the more disadvantaged communities, or are they just looking for the big projects where there would be high returns?
Yeah, so a few things. I think UNCTAD put out a report that they expect investment flows, foreign direct investment flows, to decline up to 45% in Africa and Asia this year. I don't know that all of that is due to falling interest. I think some of it is just for the issues we discussed, is that the way a lot of these firms work has to do with a lot of travel and a lot of personal interaction. And they haven't figured out ways to overcome the last steps of due diligence in order to continue their investment. And this is going to be an unsatisfying answer. Sorry, go ahead.
So, you know, and how yourself do you overcome that? Since you were asking the question to Søren, but I turn it back to you.
Yeah.
How do you manage then to try to stimulate the pipeline, knowing that you are yourself away and you cannot travel any longer?
Yeah, so good question. So, well, one of the ones that I mentioned, which as, for instance, we have these existing relationships with associations and industry groups. How do we work through them in order to reach possible investment targets, and more rapidly help develop pipelines working through organizations like that. The second is we are slightly different in that we have representation and a presence in a lot of these countries. And so while there are restrictions on individual movement in some of the countries, we are present. And so that makes it a little bit easier. And we have existing relationships with local transaction advisory firms and investment firms. I think one of the challenges is how do we use those firms in order to help them satisfy some of the needs of the foreign investors who are struggling to complete the due diligence. And that's something we're still working on.
Yeah, thank you. We'll try to see if we can hear Catherine Collin, if she is able to, if she has sorted out the problem of the microphone. I mean, not herself, but we know it's
Can you hear me now?
It's fantastic. We can hear you. Perhaps, Catherine, you were cut short in your comments, but there were also a lot then of suggestions. I mean, both from, if I just try to recap some of the main trends from the attractiveness for investments, and you're one of the few also left in the field, and since many of the international finances have been stuck home, but you are home in Nigeria. So are you used also? Do people take advantage of your presence in the field to try to create a pipeline of investments? Is that only in terms of providing loans, or sometimes there's a discussion that more equity investment is required? And perhaps there's also a question on the need to create medical hubs to respond, including in PPP, to respond to the health crisis. Have you been involved in something like that at the local level?
Okay, thank you. And again, apologies for this. I had to switch computer, and I will spare you the event of the monkey crossing the house, as I had suspected before. Anyway, I think, yeah, I was cut, and I'm really sorry about that. But on the presence on the field, I mean, I think it's important to be there, and I think people know that you are present, and all the interactions therefore are a bit more active, also vis-a-vis the local stakeholders. But I agree that the issue, of course, we are a small office here, which means that we cannot start doing all the due diligence for the colleagues in head office. So I have observed a number of virtual missions, as they call them now, from my colleagues, and I know that the colleagues in the team here have done one for Rwanda, one for Ethiopia, one for Zambia, and there was also a monitoring mission on Tanzania. And as surprising as it may be, it worked quite well. With the smile, I would say that here in Kenya, it's easier to set up a meeting with Treasury now that we are doing it virtual than sometimes doing it physical, and the waiting time is actually reduced as well. So that's an interesting observation. Did you have that experience as well, Till?
No, I think it's, well, a couple experiences. Yes, in some ways it's been easier because you don't have to go to the office. At the same time, our local teams and who work there aren't necessarily set up to work remotely. That's not the way they operate. And so it's been a very interesting mix. We're having calls with, Treasury officials and finance officials using a mixture of WhatsApp or Skype or Microsoft Teams. It's just been very ad hoc. But there's a high level of adaptability that has been impressive, even at the highest levels, in terms of trying to maintain contact. That being said, that personal interaction is really critical in most of the countries where we work. And so it means that it's going to take a multitude of conversations, not just one meeting would do. And I think
I would agree with you.
Something to take into consideration. It's going to take a lot of calls and more video conferences.
Yes. And loads of can you please hear me or something like that. But I agree with you. I mean, but still, I think that the fact of being on the field, so I don't know. I mean, on the PPP and the medical hubs, I personally have not been involved here on the ground, but I know that a lot of discussion are taking place between headquarters and WHO and the UN agency to look into that. But at this point in time, I have not yet seen a concrete result in happening here in Kenya. But I think it's in the making, and I'm sincerely hoping to be able to see it. But all these discussions are actually taking place at headquarters. And there is a lot going on in terms of a lot of creativity as well and working together. How can we put all the instruments together with the EU as well, using the EFSD guarantee scheme, and combining it with our own instruments, and also discussion with the ETFIs on how can we pool our resources and make it more efficient. So, and I think we are in an emergency situation, and so some actions have to take place now. Some will take a bit more time because, it's a fact, we are all big machines. And these big machines do need time to move on. And I'm myself being here, I'm sometimes a bit frustrated to see how long it takes to have decision made at headquarters. And there's nothing wrong about that, because the work has to be done, and we need to make sure that the investments are done in a sustainable manner. So there is all good explanation. Maybe the last point I would like to mention, because you mentioned, San, the fact that we need to think about green recovery, we need to think about gender, and these are clearly at the center of our preoccupations. But just to give you a very concrete example, we are now discussing on this SME package for Kenya, and now if we start, there was a discussion, should we put targets in terms of green economy, targets in terms of gender, then I think it's a whole matter of finding the right balance between the fact that you want to have an instrument that is rapidly deployed to respond to an emergency, or you want to put the focus on these thematic targets. And the problem is, we don't want to do greenwashing or pinkwashing. Let's be clear. Right. If we want to do a gender line, and we've done some in Uganda, there is a whole lot of work attached to it in terms of providing the technical assistance that is required for the bank to have a proper gender strategy, and then making sure that the gender dimension is fully integrated in the use of the line of credit. All of that takes time. So it's just, where do you strike the balance? I think that there is the emergency response period, and then of course there will be the recovery. And then in the recovery, I think we all agree that this is extremely important. But for me, it's a matter of striking a balance. Like Soren was mentioning, striking a balance between preserving your own balance sheet and making sure that, it's still there and fully there by helping your clients in the right way. And on the other hand, doing much more and taking much more risk. These are all difficult compromise, I think, or balance to achieve.
It is, and I think
in terms of distinction perhaps between recovery and emergency, I mean, not everything can be blurred, but recommendations I've heard by many financiers is that if you want to have a proper recovery, you have to think about it now. You cannot just think sequentially. So because it takes time, you have to start now in order to have the recovery. And indeed, the focus should be on the emergency, but even I've heard some other MDBs suggesting they would have a parallel teams, one that is responding to the emergency situation, and another team that is starting now to think about the recovery and the long term, because we should not waste an opportunity to steer better financing.
Right.
So perhaps the last. Yep, sorry, we will have to conclude. So Tilman, last
just
word.
Very quickly, I saw some. There were a couple of points in the chat with the Q&A. So just to reflect on the sort of wider architecture, how does the economic crisis in our own part of the world affect our ability to act in the response in vulnerable countries? How does, in this case, the European or European and OECD response relate to responses from emerging economies. And I think that in a way, the crisis that we're in now will be a test of the new partnership and the new role that DFIs play in development finance, which is much more, in a way, significant and level than in the last financial crisis. So, and I think in two important respects. So I think ODA is going to be quite constrained because of fiscal constraints in OECD countries, while DFIs may retain some of their firepower and ability to leverage private finance. So this is going to be absolutely crucial in the coming years and a big test for our institutions. And at the same time, I think the way that we work as OECD-based DFIs, with a lot of requirements to have quality in the companies that we invest in, having them be run responsibly, there's going to be a big test whether these kinds of companies are going to be more resilient in the crisis than companies that don't pay so much attention to this. Will we prove that being very responsible and careful investors really pays off also for the clients and their employees? I think this is something we're going to learn a lot about in the next years, and it's going to be very important for our approach.
So thank you very much. Tilman, you wanted to say last word?
Just that I think this crisis also presents an opportunity to accelerate a lot of the things that we wanted to do with finance and investment, reorienting the way that we do business to use more technology, in some sense making it more democratic by working more with local partners, including investment advisory firms and other partners, to try to really build up those opportunities. And also keep a lookout for unexpected partners. There are some organizations that stand out or begin to shine. I think we haven't really talked about just what a role the central banks are playing in some of the countries where we're working, which is not a traditional development partner, but are actually stepping up to play a role because they can move quickly. So I think there's a lot of new things for us to consider that's coming out of this to help us rethink the way we're doing business anyway.
So no business as usual, need to engage. Catherine, the last comment?
No, I think the point that Till just made is a very relevant one, and that's what I've observed is here. I mean, the Central Bank of Kenya has come quite forcefully on the front to engage in the dialogue and see how best to help. And actually, it's interesting because they came to us bringing back an old instrument that we used to have under LOME, which was the APEX global loans, where we were channeling the money through the central banks. And they were, not sure this is what we're going to do, but it was interesting to see that they wanted to come back and be in the forefront of being able, plus the fact that they have also announced a number of measures asking the banks to relax some of their criteria and to put in place some forbearance and all that for the clients. So I think, yes, indeed, these actors are now becoming a bit more prominent in the whole setup, and there are new actors coming up. That I fully agree with that.
Thank you very much. I think it is very important indeed that we don't have business as usual, that we think about innovative ways of engaging, and to think also beyond the only projects and the limited impact of a project, but to think about what is the systemic impact that the involvement of finance can have also in helping the local institutions and building on the local initiatives. And connected also, as Søren was mentioning before, also to the regulatory environment and policy environment. So there is a need to have a much more interconnected framework. So thank you very much for your very practical input. We'll continue that discussion. We knew that in an hour or 15 minutes we couldn't cover all the issues related to finance. I will lead you to look at our respective institutional websites, where we also have a lot of information. We'll continue to have other meetings. We're preparing with several of you also other public meetings on this issue. And in the context of this specific webinar, the series on practical perspectives, we will have the next one next Monday, which will be on building a stronger health system. and how we can have initiatives to do so in a most effective way. These, in case you have missed one of the sessions, they are recorded, so they are also available on our website where you can look at them. And I thank you very much all for your participation and for your questions. Thanks a lot to our speakers. And I wish you an excellent week and see you next Monday. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thanks very much, Son. Thank you.